What happens when a US congresswoman answers a call, live on national television, and hears news so devastating she breaks down in front of millions? This isn't just a viral moment. It's a story of real grief, unexpected courage, and a global connection that no one saw coming. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you may never look at leadership or empathy the same way again. The studio lights were bright, casting a clean, polished glow over the news desk. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat poised and confident, responding thoughtfully to yet another question about the state of agricultural reform in rural America. She had answered versions of this same question 100 times, her voice steady, her presence firm, never betraying how tired she sometimes was of the political theatre. But she believed in this issue. That's why she was there. That's why she kept showing up. The interview was live, mid-segment, and broadcast to millions across the country. Viewers at home watched from their couches with half interest, flipping between channels, scrolling on their phones, sipping their coffee. No one could have predicted that what came next would stop the entire broadcast, and moments later, the nation itself. Jasmine's phone, usually silenced or tucked away, vibrated sharply against the polished desk. The hosts paused briefly, expecting her to ignore it, but instead she glanced down, furrowed her brow, and instinctively picked it up. She didn't ask for the cameras to cut. She didn't hesitate. She answered it. There was a pause, short, then heavy. "President Traoré?" she said softly, her expression shifting in real time from focused professionalism to something more fragile, more human. The hosts looked stunned. The production crew scrambled behind the scenes, unsure if they should break from the feed. But Jasmine raised her hand gently, signaling, "Let it roll." Her body tensed, not in fear, but in emotional anticipation. Her lips pressed together as she listened. And then, suddenly, her eyes filled with tears. One slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Her breath hitched audibly. And then she whispered a single word that would echo far beyond the studio. "Children." The cameras kept rolling. There was no background music, no dramatic voiceover, no planned crescendo. Just a woman, a congresswoman, receiving news that would devastate anyone with a beating heart. On the other end of the line, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso was delivering horrifying news. A school in Kaya had been bombed, another senseless act of terror in a region too often overlooked by global media. Children were among the dead. Aid workers, too. Among them, an American nurse whose name Jasmine recognized. It was personal now, too personal. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett did not react as a politician. She reacted as a human being. Her shoulders sagged, her voice cracked. She murmured an apology, not to the viewers, not to the producers, but to the children. To their families, to anyone in the world who still believed wrongly that some tragedies were too far away to matter. It was raw. It was real. And it was not the kind of emotion we're used to seeing from elected officials, especially live, unscripted, and unrehearsed. By the time the call ended, the room was silent. The hosts didn't know what to say. Neither did Jasmine. She simply sat there, hands folded in her lap, eyes red, composing herself not for optics, but because that's what grief demands when it suddenly, rudely interrupts our day. That 30-second moment wasn't meant to be history, but it became one. Weeks before that call shattered the rhythm of a national broadcast, before tears turned into headlines and emotion turned into a movement, Jasmine Crockett had sat quietly in a low-lit cafe tucked between two brownstones just blocks from the Capitol. It wasn't a high-level meeting room. There were no staffers, no journalists, no security, just two public servants sharing bitter coffee and heavier stories. President Ibrahim Traoré had asked for a private conversation during his brief visit to Washington. Most lawmakers hadn't responded. To them, Burkina Faso was a distant concern, an abstract name in foreign affairs briefings, not something worth rearranging their calendars for. But Jasmine had said yes, without a camera, without a press release. She arrived early, notebook in hand. He arrived alone. From the beginning, there was a solemnity in his presence. Ibrahim didn't speak like a man trying to impress. He spoke like someone who had run out of time for pretending. He told her of what he'd seen back home: burned classrooms, children gone missing, terrified parents still showing up at empty schools every morning just to hope. There were American volunteers there too, young, eager, idealistic. They had been trying to help. One of them, a nurse from Baltimore named Serena Langston, had written Ibrahim a letter before her last assignment.
Jasmine read it right there in the cafe. In elegant, slanted handwriting, Serena had written, "If the world won't watch, then we'll just have to be the light ourselves." Jasmine held the letter for a long time. She didn't say much, just listened. She had been trained, like many in her position, to filter emotion through political viability. But something in Ibrahim's voice, and even more in Serena's words, cut through that filter. When he showed her the photographs, she didn't look away. Children in handmade uniforms, classrooms with chalkboards riddled by shrapnel, smiles from students who had no idea what tomorrow would bring. He wasn't asking her to save the world. He was asking her to care. She promised him she would try, that she would raise the issue in committee hearings, push for aid in backroom negotiations, mention the names of forgotten towns on the record. She knew most of it wouldn't make headlines. She did it anyway. As they parted, Ibrahim had said something she wouldn't forget. "Your voice travels farther than you think, even when it feels like no one's listening." She had smiled politely then. She believed him, but not deeply. Not yet. In the days that followed, she brought up Burkina Faso 3 times in closed-door sessions. Each time, she was met with polite nods and redirections to more pressing domestic matters. Infrastructure, farm subsidies, gas prices. She nodded too, because that was the game. But privately, she began writing a speech, one she didn't know when or if she'd ever give. It was about visibility, about loss, about not turning away from grief just because it wasn't ours. She never finished that speech, because the world, as it often does, didn't wait for permission to deliver its pain. It just called, and she answered. By the time the clip of Jasmine Crockett answering the call hit social media, the moment had already taken on a life of its own. The raw footage, her quiet voice cracking, the tears falling slowly, her whisper of the word children, wasn't heavily edited, didn't need dramatic music or voiceover. It didn't even have context. It didn't need it. People knew what they were watching. The video spread across Twitter, then TikTok, then the nightly news. One station froze the frame just after she ended the call, her hands clenched together in her lap, her mouth trembling. A caption read, "Congresswoman breaks down on live TV." But what really happened wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. At first, reactions were mixed. Some political commentators called it unprofessional. Others called it brave. A few tried to weaponize it. Right-wing pundits claimed she had used her tears for drama. Talk radio hosts mocked the emotion as weakness, declaring that lawmakers should be tougher and more composed. But something unexpected began to happen as the clip continued to circulate. Americans began to respond, not as voters, but as humans. A teacher from Ohio commented, "I've cried in my classroom when my students lost someone to gun violence. I've never once apologized for that." A veteran in Texas posted, "If our leaders don't feel anything when kids are dying, they shouldn't be leading." An immigrant mother in New York wrote, "That one tear said everything I've felt watching tragedies in my home country be ignored. Thank you for not looking away." Jasmine, meanwhile, said nothing for 2 days. Her team issued no press release, no spin, no damage control. She stayed home. She didn't watch cable news. She didn't scroll the endless wave of hot takes. She sat with her thoughts, and with Serena Langston's letter still folded in her journal. On the third morning, she posted an image on her personal Instagram. It was just a photo of her open palm holding a silver bracelet with small letter charms that spelled hope. The caption read, "I was going to delete the video, then I watched it again, and I saw something I didn't expect. I saw what it looks like to still feel. In a time when so many are numb, I'm not ashamed of those tears. I'm grateful for them, because that means I'm still human. I hope we all are." No hashtags, no tagging, just that. The post was shared over 400,000 times in 24 hours. Thousands commented, not on her politics, but on her heart. Young activists, nurses, trauma workers, parents, pastors, high school students, they all said the same thing in different words. "You made space for us to feel again." She spent the next week responding to as many of them as she could, not with campaign slogans, with empathy. One comment from a 17-year-old student in Chicago simply read, "Thank you for crying so we knew it was okay to care." And Jasmine wrote back, "It's not just okay, it's necessary." By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped back in front of a microphone, the world was waiting, but not for a soundbite. People weren't expecting a polished political statement or a defensive rebuttal to the critics. What they wanted, what they needed, was honesty.
And Jasmine gave it to them. She chose not to stand at the Capitol, not in front of cable cameras or a party backdrop. Instead, she traveled to Milwaukee and stood in a modest community center, its walls lined with folding chairs and worn posters about food drives and neighborhood cleanups. The kind of place where real stories live. The room was full, not with journalists, but with locals, teachers, parents, veterans, people who had watched her video and felt something stir inside them. There were no teleprompters, just a mic, her voice, and a single podium marked by fingerprints from dozens of voices before hers. She began slowly, not with a headline, but with a truth. "I wasn't supposed to answer that call," she said. "I wasn't supposed to cry. I wasn't supposed to show that I cared about something happening thousands of miles away. But I did, and I don't regret it." She paused. The room held its breath. We've built a world where showing emotion is seen as a liability, where grief is political, where compassion comes with a cost. But if that's the price of staying human, I'll pay it. Every time. The audience didn't clap at first. They just nodded, some biting their lips, some wiping away tears. Because in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a mirror. Then she said the words that would ripple across the country. Grief is not unpatriotic. With those 6 words, she cracked something open in the hearts of people who had long been told to toughen up, move on, stay quiet. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It wasn't just about politics. It was about a country full of people carrying invisible grief, grief they were told wasn't valid unless it made the headlines. After the speech, people lined up, not for selfies, but for stories. A father spoke about losing his daughter to an overdose and being told to stop bringing it up. A school counselor shared how she keeps a drawer of tissues in her office and uses them more than anyone else. A young woman, recently granted asylum from Venezuela, simply held Jasmine's hand and whispered, "You remembered us." Back home, networks finally began to shift the narrative. A segment on PBS led with, "When leaders cry, we remember they're still listening." Op-eds followed. Faith leaders and civil rights advocates quoted her speech. The phrase, "Grief is not unpatriotic," was printed on T-shirts, pinned to backpacks, taped inside lockers. It became a mantra, not of mourning, but of empathy. And still Jasmine didn't center herself. In her next public statement, she said, "I hope we make space for grief not because it's convenient, but because it's honest. And in that honesty, maybe we find our way back to each other." In an age defined by noise, she had chosen silence and then spoken from its center. Weeks had passed since the moment that changed everything, and yet the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's quiet courage still rippled outward. What had begun as a spontaneous act of humanity on live television was no longer a moment, it was becoming a movement. One afternoon in early spring, Jasmine sat in her Washington office surrounded by a small team, reviewing letters from across the country. Some came from policy advocates and international aid workers, others from ordinary people, teachers, veterans, single parents, college students. They all shared a common thread. Her tears had reminded them that feeling wasn't weakness, it was a signal of strength. But there was one message she hadn't expected, a video message from President Ibrahim Traoré, sent from a school courtyard in Kaya, where the bombing had occurred. Standing in front of newly repainted walls and desks donated by international partners, Ibrahim introduced a group of students. Their faces were full of cautious hope. A few had lost siblings or teachers in the attack. One, a 12-year-old girl named Sira, held up a handmade sign that read, "Thank you for crying for us." Jasmine's eyes welled up again, not with helplessness, but with purpose. Later that week, she and President Traoré hosted a virtual summit together, streamed publicly and translated in real time. They weren't surrounded by diplomats or pundits, but by children, students from schools in Kaya, classrooms in Baltimore, Oakland, and Detroit. The conversation wasn't about politics, it was about empathy, and about what it means to be seen by someone far away and still feel close. Together they announced the creation of the Lantern Fund, named after Serena Langston, the American nurse who had died in the bombing. The fund would support education and trauma healing in conflict zones around the world, beginning with a scholarship program connecting African and American students. Jasmine contributed the first donation from her own salary. The announcement made headlines, but it was the tone of the summit that lingered. No one was shouting, no one was posturing.
Just voices, young and old, listening, sharing, and quietly building something that didn't exist before that call. After the live stream ended, Jasmine stayed on the line with Sira and her classmates. They asked if she remembered what she said during the call that day. Jasmine smiled. "I remember every second," she said, "because it changed me." That evening, she walked through the National Mall alone. Cherry blossoms were just beginning to bloom, soft petals drifting in the breeze. She thought about how grief had once made her feel powerless, and now it had become the very force pulling people together. Not long ago, she had been criticized for being too emotional. Now, people were quoting her in classrooms, in sermons, in street murals. A muralist in Oakland painted her silhouette beside the words, "Compassion isn't a liability, it's leadership." Looking up at the pale sky, Jasmine whispered to no one in particular, "Let it grow." And it did. Because the truth is, What she planted in that moment of vulnerability wasn't just empathy, it was legacy. Jasmine Crockett didn't plan to cry on live television. She didn't plan for a private phone call with President Ibrahim Traoré to break into a national broadcast. And she certainly didn't expect her raw, human reaction to spark a movement of empathy that would stretch across oceans. But sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones we craft, they're the ones that break through us. From a quiet cafe in DC to a bombed school in Kaya, this story followed a thread woven not through political speeches or campaign slogans, but through simple, honest connection. Jasmine listened when others didn't. She remembered when others forgot. And when the world called her to care, even in the middle of a routine policy segment, she didn't hesitate. She answered. What followed was extraordinary. Not just the viral clip, not just the headlines, but what came after. A country willing to reflect and people ready to feel again. Grief became a gateway to action. Emotion became evidence of integrity, not weakness. And vulnerability became a form of leadership that didn't seek power, but purpose. She didn't fight back against the noise with more noise. She spoke softly. She showed up. She built bridges where others might have built walls. And in doing so, she reminded all of us that leadership doesn't always look like strength in armor. Sometimes it looks like someone standing in their truth, even while holding back tears. The most important lesson from Jasmine's story isn't about politics or headlines, it's about presence. She taught us that the bravest thing we can do in a hardened world is to stay tender, to stay awake to pain that isn't our own, to let grief matter even when it's inconvenient, to understand that compassion, especially in public life, is not a liability, it's a lifeline. So how can you apply this lesson to your own life? When someone around you is hurting, pause. Don't dismiss, don't rush to fix, just listen. If there's a tragedy in a place you've never been, read about it anyway. Share it. Donate if you can. Speak about it. Be a witness. Because when we pay attention to sorrow that isn't ours, we slowly stitch the world back together. Even the smallest act of care can be the beginning of something larger than you. Now here's your question. Which kind of response do you believe creates the most lasting change? A. Bold speeches and forceful declarations. B. Quiet courage and heartfelt action. Comment A or B below. We want to hear what you think and why. And while you're at it, let us know what part of Jasmine's story moved you most. Your insights, your emotions, and your perspective might be the very thing someone else needs to read today. So share them in the comments. Your voice matters here. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of the power of empathy, truth, and tears, please hit subscribe.
Your support fuels our ability to bring you more stories that matter, that uplift, and that help all of us stay connected to our shared humanity. Thank you for being here. Stay soft, stay strong, and keep showing up.